Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am hopeful and I'm absolutely sure that we're going to have a very interesting and interactive afternoon. So thank you all for joining us. We have Tom Kiehl, who is from UK Music, and Tom is one of our guest speakers, and we're very grateful that he has joined us. We also have Harriet Harman, the MP for Camberwell and Peckham, and she has done a lot in this area in relation to EU nationals, UK nationals touring and so on in Europe, and hopefully we're going to hear a lot from Harriet. I simply tell you sort of the format of this afternoon. One of the first things I should mention is that we are recording this afternoon session, and typically what we tend to do is after the webinar we edit it and then we send it to the speakers for their approval. Once we've done that, then we will share it with the rest of our guest list this afternoon. Now, just to set the scene, we are looking at, and we invited Tom and Harriet to join us on the panel this afternoon because we want to explore what's happening if a UK national wants to go to Europe and perform in a concert, and almost vice versa. As many of you will know, obviously the UK left Europe at 11 o'clock on the 31st of December last year. I mentioned earlier to my colleague Robert that we continue to see some issues coming out because we've now left. So even from a work permit perspective, I have UK nationals saying to me, Marcia, what do I do if I want to go to France or Italy or Germany or Spain and work and so on? And I think there is still continued concerns, if you like, as to on a practical level what is happening and what we should be doing. Obviously we all want to, you know, abide by the law and so on, but it's simply trying to navigate what's allowed from what isn't allowed. What I'm going to do this afternoon, or what we're going to do this afternoon, is my colleague Robert Houchell, who's one of the associates in the team, is going to go through and talk about what we're allowed to do right now as a UK national going to Europe, or sorry, EU nationals coming into the UK, what the law looks like now, and then we'll hear from Tom, who will hopefully give us some insights into what his members are going through. And then finally, Harriet will talk about what she's been doing with the government to try and level this out and get some positive outcomes with the government. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague, Robert. Many thanks. Sorry, I will also mention that we have a Q&A function, and if you've got any questions, I will be reviewing the Q&A and hopefully we'll put that to our guests, but we'll also have an opportunity at the end to, I think, have a good old discussion. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Marcia. So let me start by trying to share my screen and the slides that I've got. So there are immigration options for creative people to come to the UK, or for some creative people to come to the UK. So to begin with, what I want to do is just sort of race through what those options are. And it's important to get it right, because if you get it wrong, what can happen is people can be refused entry, which is a drama best avoided. You can have entry bans for individuals, and indeed UK organisations that employ people illegally can be issued with civil penalties. And indeed, it is actually a criminal offence to knowingly employ someone who is here illegally in the UK. So sometimes when we talk to clients and potential clients about the immigration rules and they realise that we don't quite satisfy that, but we're just going to wing it anyway, and that's really not a very good approach. Okay, so to start, we've got entry as a visitor. So for non-visa nationals, so that includes EU and US nationals, that when they arrive at the border, just with their passport typically, and they seek to be admitted as a visitor. So when you're in the UK as a visitor, obviously there's lots of restrictions on what you can do. You can't work, but you can undertake certain permitted activities which aren't considered to constitute work. And these include giving performances, taking part in personal promotional events, and taking part in auditions. The big drawback of being a visitor is that generally you can't be paid from a UK source. So there is a carve out, and there's an exception to this rule for permit-free events. So that's certain large events such as Reading Festival or Leeds Festival, where visitors can be paid for performing at those events, but it's only about performance, it's not about support. Okay, so we've got also another type of visitor category, that's the permitted paid engagement visitor, and this is for professional artists, entertainers, musicians who are coming to the UK to do something connected to their profession. Now it's a bit more generous in that they can be paid from a UK source, but they can only come to the UK for up to 1 month, and they require some documents. So they need a written invitation from the UK organisation that's inviting them, and normally they also need other material to evidence that they meet the requirements to come in as under the permitted paid engagement category. So if you're a recognisable musician, you sort of sail through border control typically, but if you're someone who's not well known, then you normally get a bit more scrutiny at the border, and you have to satisfy an immigration officer that you meet the requirements to enter under the permitted paid engagement category. So for non-visa nationals, they can seek to be admitted under this category at the border, and visa nationals will obviously need to apply for visas before they travel. Next, we've got the T5 creative category, and this requires a UK organisation with a sponsor licence, so it's applied to the UKVI, it's the Home Office, being given a licence, and then it can issue certificates of sponsorship to individuals to come to the UK to undertake certain activities. For non-visa nationals, if they're coming for up to 3 months, they can just arrive at the border without applying for a visa first, with their certificate of sponsorship, talk to an immigration officer, and hopefully be admitted under the T5 creative category. If they're coming for longer than 3 months, or if they're if they're a visa national, then they need to apply for a visa before they travel. So that's going to a visa application centre, handing in your passport, giving your biometrics and all that extra work that's required. UK organisations can't just issue certificates of sponsorship to anyone and everyone. They have to make sure that the role that they're sponsoring meets some certain requirements, and indeed it may even be necessary to evidence that they can't find someone in the UK to do the job, or for them to be satisfied that they can't find someone to do the job in the UK before they sponsor someone to come here to do the work. So we talked about permitted paid engagement and visitor, and also the T5 creative category. So they're sort of the well-trodden paths for creative people into the UK, but there are also some other immigration options. So we've got the T5 international agreement. So this has come about largely due to, or as a result of the withdrawal agreement, and it's created this new category, and it does to some extent cover entertainment or people working in the entertainment sector. It's very fiddly. You still need a sponsor, but it is there. It's hard to see how it would be used in place of the T5 creative route, but nevertheless, it's worth giving it a mention. We've also got the global talent route. So this is for artists who have made it or are very much on their way to making it, and they can potentially get endorsement from the Arts Council to apply for a visa, which would give them permission to live in the UK. It's a route that's much more suited to people who, well, it is suited for people who want to live and be permanently based or predominantly based in the UK. It is not for those coming to do short-term assignments necessarily. And finally, we've got the skilled worker route. So this is the main work visa for non-creative people to come into the UK. So your sort of bankers, insurance professionals and so on, they normally will apply for a skilled worker visa. It's undergone, so this category has undergone lots of changes. So they've removed the requirement to advertise, removed the calling off period, lowered the skill level. So all these sorts of changes that mean that perhaps in some instances it's possible that there might be a use for the skilled worker category for creative people to come into the UK. But a skilled worker visa is expensive generally, and indeed actually getting any visa to come to the UK is an expense and quite expensive. Okay, so let me try and stop sharing my slides. So Tom, if I can pick on you and ask you some questions, if that's okay. So when you're talking to your members about bringing people into the UK? What are their main gripes and complaints about the current UK immigration system?
Sure, thank you. And just to give a bit of context, UK Music is the umbrella body for the music industry. So we bring together all the various component parts, whether that's the recorded sector, the publishing sector, the live sector, the creative organisations, and the collective management organisations as well. So we're quite a globally unique organisation in that sense. I think in terms of like the main issues that they have. The Tier 5 system is the one which would be used most commonly, I think, for your bigger, large-scale artists. It's the sort of route that Madonna, etc., those people would be using to get into the country. Obviously, there's an expense side of that, but it's well trodden, and it's accepted by the kind of bigger scale operators. That's the route to use. The kind of permitted paid engagement level is more appropriate for people who are not quite at that level yet. I think one of the challenges we see is actually around confidence within the industry that is necessarily accepted at a border level, and sometimes it's a bit sporadic, I think, in terms of whether border guards and security, etc., necessarily acknowledge it as a system. So it's a cheaper system, it's a more cost-effective system to utilise that, but there's a concern that it potentially leaves us exposed because it doesn't give the protections in that way. And I think one of the problems that we may be seeing with the Tier 5 system too, as well, with a consequence of leaving the European Union, is that it actually increased the number of certificates that will have to be issued, and whether there is capacity within the issuing parties, because obviously if we weren't going through the pandemic at the moment, we would be dealing with a lot of people, performers coming over for the new summer festival season. So there needs to be kind of scope and depth, I think, within the immigration service to support that. Obviously, we're focusing very much here on short-term visitor routes. Obviously, the music industry also does employ people on a longer-term basis from outside the UK too. I think one of the problems we see there is sometimes requirements, etc. For the government has moved much more to a points-based system, where you're dealing with a situation where skills and salary and those kind of conditions are much more something that is needed to qualify. A lot of musicians don't get paid very much money at all, and maybe below the average annual wage. So that doesn't work for them to have a kind of salary basis. And also, skills is a difficult one. Paul McCartney does not know how to read music, but obviously he's been incredible. His entire career has been built around it. So how do you really quantify skills within our sector in that way? So I think the system of the kind of visitor route at the moment, it has challenges. We would want to see them improve, but also I think that some of the challenges also exist within the longer term permanent basis migration routes.
Yeah, it's very difficult for the system to accommodate creative people, it seems.
Yeah.
So obviously, British citizens, we've now lost our right to free movement, disappointingly. So a lot of your members, I presume, are going into Europe and doing work, or were doing that previously. What's their take on, or what's the UK Music's take on the changes and their worries? Or are they worried is an issue that we've lost free movement for your members?
Yes, I mean, it was one of our big concerns before the great agreement that we would end up with a situation where we'd have to navigate 27 different countries with different rules, requirements, etc. There is a deal, but still we had that concern because the deal that was reached at the end of last year was absent on that point. They did not reach an agreement, an EU-wide agreement, in terms of how our outbound needs can be catered for. And so parliamentarians such as Harriet, who you'll be hearing from later, have been taking up a lot of that cause, which is really welcome. I think that the concern is that Previously, we were operating in a situation where you could do a concert one night in Amsterdam and the next in Paris. You wouldn't necessarily have to navigate different systems. One of the things that we've found and explored is really try to get to the bottom of that in the last few months. What are the kind of areas, countries where there are difficulties? Certainly countries like Spain, countries like Portugal, potentially countries like Bulgaria, Croatia. These are countries which will require some kind of degree of permission, where we wouldn't have needed before. So there's a cost aspect to this. There's also a concern about just the sheer bureaucracy. And I think aside from the very real issue around permits and visas, there's also issues around things called carnets, which is for physical goods, moving your music instrument, etc. And I think there is some scope for that being okay, but also it depends on how how that is then interpreted in practice. And similarly around social security too. So there's a whole manner of systems. Obviously, we're talking primarily here about freedom of movement, but beyond that, there are lots of many other aspects which are very intrinsically based within how people tour, and that needs to be taken into consideration too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much information and resources of information you need to pull together. It's just logistically such a challenge. So obviously, you guys, UK Music, you're trying to push for change. Lots of people are trying to push for change to get some sort of reversal of the deal that we have. And how's that going? What stage are you guys up to? Is there any sort of movement or encouragement from the government on this?
Sure. Well, the government is there's a process which the government has undertaken, whereby they do have a working group which is working on these issues. The next meeting of that working group, I think, is next week. So there's a process where the government has responded to the concern and criticisms that have been raised, and we do wait to see what comes out of that. A couple of things that have been suggested are, can we get some kind of temporary fund that kind of can be put in place to mitigate that? You look at an industry like the fishing industry, they secured 23 million out of the government to help manage Brexit transitions, and that's something that there is active conversations about whether the similar situation could be achieved for music when we're properly up and running again. More broadly, on the longer term, export support. Can we have more infrastructure within government and industry working together on that? So there's potential to get changes in that regard. I think one of the biggest challenges, however, I think is getting those changes to the agreement, because the government's position, having spent the last 4 or 5 years negotiating its way out of the European Union, is not necessarily minded to reach a new deal at this point in time, even if it's on an area which is of great concern. That said, the Prime Minister did recently give evidence to the liaison committee, and in that evidence he did indicate that he was effectively commissioning his consulates, his embassy staff to negotiate or speak to counterparts in the kind of member states. So it may be a bilateral level is maybe where we might get more progress from our government and partner governments over in other member states to reaching some kind of agreement.
Cool, that's encouraging. There might be some sort of movement.
Yeah, I think, do you know what, Tom, I'm listening to you. I think it's obviously very interesting, but also when you talk about, that next week there's going to be a meeting and so on, I think what disappoints me, and perhaps, you might agree with this, is why has it taken so long, I guess, because like you quite rightly said, there were 4 or 5 years of negotiating the UK leaving Europe. Was it as simple as this particular item was just left off the agenda?
The government has. There's been a bit of a blame game after the deal. There was. We made obviously lots of representations before Brexit. The government has said that they put forward a proposal which was rejected by the European Union. Similarly, the European Union has suggested that they have put forward a deal that was rejected by the UK. So, I mean, from our perspective, actually is positive, and we should kind of hold on to that, because although we won't achieve that at the time, it does show a willingness, a recognition that there is an issue there. If the problem is, presumably because of how it doesn't quite square with the government's interpretation of what Brexit is and how that works in practice, the solution that the European Union was proposing doesn't quite compute with that. I think that's the problem, and why we're in this situation now. Which
I think leads us to nicely segue and bring Harriet into this discussion. And I think one of the things I suppose I'd like to ask you, Harriet, is you've obviously done a lot of work in this area, and I have had the benefit of seeing and and watching everything that you've been doing and reading a lot about it. Why do you think it's so important between the UK and the EU? It sounds like an obvious question, but A, why do you think they've taken so long? So very much the similar question I put to Tom. And also, from a financial perspective, I've seen some of the figures and how much value the UK music industry brings to the UK. Why do you think it was something that the government didn't think more about or prepare more for it?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion. And I didn't know whether to be encouraged by how lucid Robert was with his description, or just feel absolutely dismayed about the complexity of it. And then hearing all the work that Tom is doing with the other organisations in the sector, which is so important. The thing is, it's just not sustainable. It's not sustainable for us to have the creative sector, the music sector that we have in this country, unless it's actually changed. All the advice in the world that can be given, and it's really important, all the transitional funding, which has yet to appear but would be incredibly useful, is important. But actually, we need to sort this out. So the bad news is that if it just carries on like this, it will suffocate the music industry creatively, because you don't want to be off isolated as an island. You want that interplay, that creative interplay between musicians. Personnel wise, it will cut people off from working together. And of course, financially, the business model just does not work without EU touring. So many of our orchestras, bands, individuals, they depend for a great deal of their income on EU touring. And I think the government understand about the fishing industry, that actually, unless they get those scallops off the quay, off the dockside, into the EU market, they will go off. They also understand that actually that's where a certain percentage of the exports go. I think it's slightly more difficult for the government to see with music, and the music sector has just got on and done it in the past, whereas you've got organisations like the National Farmers Union who've got a kind of complete, permanent linked in with the government, because they are dealing with the machinery of subsidies the whole time. Because the music industry has been, self-financing to the large part and motivating itself and not asking the government, therefore it's enabled it to be outside of the government's view. But it mustn't be outside the government's view, because it's incredibly important for people's identity creatively and also financially. So that's the bad news, is that it's just not sustainable if it's not changed. The good news is, as Tom says, the Prime Minister gave evidence to the liaison committee of the House of Commons, which is all the different select committees sitting together. And Julian Knight, who is the chair of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, he asked the Prime Minister specifically about this. And the good thing was the Prime Minister said, yes, I know this is a problem. Yes, I know we've got to get it sorted out. Yes, Lord Frost is going to be in the lead on this. It's his responsibility. And we are going to negotiate bilaterally, one-to-one with different countries in Europe until such time as we can get a Europe-wide agreement. So that was good. But then he said, but we've got time, because of course, Brexit means nobody's doing anything. But of course, people are doing things. They are planning. They are planning. Tours need to be planned months in advance. And as Tom has said, It's about the individual performer, but it's also about the support team. It's also about the transport. And we've got a very sophisticated and well-developed industry, highly professionalized for transporting musical instruments, lighting. So there's that, and there's problems with what's called cabotage, with loads of rules that if you have 3 stops, you have to go home. Well, that means most tours are not viable on that basis. And also instruments, because you have to get certification that that bit of rosewood on your violin peg is not endangered Brazilian rosewood, but was, you know, from a tree in Germany 2 centuries ago, and you have to have all that certification. So it's the instrument, it's the transport, and it's the performers, and it all needs to get sorted out. Now, I've mentioned Lord Frost, and he's going to give evidence to the Department of Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee on the 10th of June. Okay. And that is a very important date to be watching. But ahead of the 10th of June, here is, I think, the names that those people who are sharing in this discussion today need to have in their mind. I've mentioned Julian Knight, who's the chair of the DCMS Select Committee. I think we have to have a DCMS Select Committee inquiry into this. Anything that's important has a Select Committee inquiring into it. And that really is about Parliament as a whole looking into it. The committee looks into it on behalf of Parliament. So we need a Select Committee inquiry into EU touring. And the key person on that is Julian Knight. So actually asking Julian Knight to do a Select Committee inquiry will give him the encouragement to actually decide to do an inquiry.
Sorry, let me quickly ask you this. So are you saying to our audience today that they should do something to actually reach out to this individual and to put their thoughts forward?
Yes, and also all the members, you can look online, all the members of the DCMS Select Committee, if you write to them and say, the Prime Minister has said this needs to get sorted, we have got no evidence that it's being sorted as yet, can we have a Select Committee inquiry? Because that will mean everybody can give evidence to it, artists can come in front of it, give evidence publicly, and then it draws it all together, all the facts and figures, and then they can report saying, actually, something needs to happen. So that's Julian Knight and the DCMS Select Committee. Then there is Oliver Dowden, who is the Secretary of State for the Department of Culture, Media, Sport, and also his minister, Caroline Dinenage. Now, they have responsibility for the sector. She is the arts minister for the music sector, but she doesn't have the power to pull the levers for the EU negotiations. That's EU Frost. But Lord Frost has got the EU negotiation responsibility. So Oliver Dowden is the Secretary of State. Caroline Dinenage is the person responsible within that department for the sector, and Lord Frost, and Julian Knight as chair of the Select Committee. Because the thing about this is that it's not just some sort of geological activity. It's something which could be agreed between the EU or between individual member states and the UK and our government. And what it needs for actually change to happen is it needs for the government to reopen negotiations. Now, they've got lots of more negotiations going on about fish, about agriculture, about the automotive industry. They've got to feel the pressure that actually this is necessary. And I mean, if they just objectively looked at the numbers on a page, they would understand it. But sometimes it's the pressure that makes you do it. So I think really everybody who's involved obviously needs to, I think, help be part of the movement to get this changed. And I think in a way that there's a threefold problem, because those at the top of their classical music career, many of them have got the option to relocate abroad, and some of them are already doing that just because they can't necessarily carry on their work, going to opera houses where you might have a 2-month run, what with rehearsals and then performances, it's just too difficult to be based here. So many of them, it'll tip the balance and make them relocate into the EU. Those who are just starting off, I mean, didn't Ed Sheeran busk all the way around Europe to get himself going, to craft his trade? and many of them, well, they just won't be able to get going. And those in the middle who've got a sort of reasonable career but who depend on touring in Europe will find it's just not financially viable. So the business model of creativity and the finances requires this to be sorted out. And if you think about it, the big organizations, it just becomes very expensive for them to tour with all these visas, even though they've got the administrative support to do all the different negotiations. It becomes too expensive. And the individuals, you know, they just can't afford to become experts on this. They can't afford to pay advisors. They can't afford the time to be doing it themselves. They've got to be practicing, rehearsing, performing. That's how they make their living. They can't make their living if they're paying money for visas, for work permits, and trying to get advice. So the business model of our music sector doesn't work unless this is sorted out. And we really, you know, and obviously Tom and all the music sector organisations are trying to mobilise the pressure. And there are MPs in all parties who are understanding of this. And who will work with you to get it changed. But I think, you know, time is of the essence here.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Harriet. I think one of the, just to pick up on your point, obviously time is of the essence, because quite clearly, you know, we are coming out of the pandemic, sort of fingers crossed, right? And so Tom might correct me on this, but festival season is coming, you know, it's coming. And if we're allowed to do, you know, UK nationals wanting to go to Europe are going to want to do what they've always done. And everyone, you know, people are almost desperate for music and so on. So, you know, that's incredibly obviously really important. And I think it's, again, I'll say it's incredibly disappointing that it's all taking so long, and we are literally coming up to festival season and concerts and so on. And I saw I watched the Brits the other day, and I know that the government did something whereby that was allowed, and it was at the O2, and everyone just had to make sure they took tests and things like that beforehand. But that means that they are watching it, or they've got an awareness of the whole music industry. But how long do we think it's going to take for them to actually do anything? You know,
well, that will be a function. I mean, if that's not a rhetorical question, that will be a function of how far up the agenda it's pushed. Because I have as yet detected no really serious efforts for ministers. Right. You see, ministers should be picking up the phone, ministers in Lord Frost's department, Lord Frost himself, ought to be picking up the phone to Spain, to France, to Germany, to Italy, saying, right, how can we facilitate your professionals, your artists coming here? Because that is part of, it's not just them coming here, it's all the tourists who come here to the venues that actually, how can we facilitate them coming here? And how can you facilitate our people coming to you? That is till such time as we have complete visa and permit-free touring throughout the EU. So I think the ultimate objective must be an EU-wide visa and permit-free touring arrangement. But in the meantime, we need quickly bilateral arrangements. But I don't yet detect any serious ministerial action one-to-one, country to country. And it's as Tom said, there's a bit of a blame game. It's not clear whether it's the EU don't want to do this, or the individual member states don't want to do this, or whether or not the UK is not trying to encourage them to do this. So we need to somehow have a bit of an EU and country by country strategy, as well as pushing on our government. I mean, there's no doubt if they did push on it, they would make some progress. The
other thing I want to ask you, Harriet, is, so I obviously had the privilege of looking at your 10-point plan and the paper that you wrote. Now, what was the response to your 10-point plan? Tell us, what's the response?
I can tell you what the response is, because I've got a grid of my 10 points here, and you can see too many of them are on red. We wanted the government to actually identify a minister who would take responsibility for sorting that out. That's on green. That's Lord Frost. So it is quite evident what should be done. This is not something that the government can't do. It's just something that at the moment the government is not doing. And I think that it's not either something where there is within the governing party, within the Conservative Party, you know, massive political opposition to doing this. It's just, it's too low down the agenda. It will take effort. And therefore, in order for it to justify the effort, when God knows they've got enough on their plate at the moment, what with Brexit and COVID, but in order for it to actually, for that effort to happen, it's got to be pushed up their agenda.
Mm. And I will just say this, obviously there's the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, right? The TCA, which is continuously going through various negotiation stages. And I know that there are certain parties within Parliament who are dealing with certain areas of that. So if that's moving along, surely, or am I making it too simple, they could add this to that agenda, because during the TCA, they're doing negotiations with Europe about certain elements of that. Why would they not put such an important topic?
I mean, Lord Frost will be on the phone or on every other sort of technological communication with the EU morning, noon and night.
Yeah.
But he is not yet on this issue. And because we're dealing with a whole ecosystem, they can't leave it too long, or the EU side, well, they're already starting to make decisions to book only EU creative professionals because, you know, it's too uncertain and too complicated and they don't know whether they can rely on UK people to come over. So they're already starting to turn away from our UK sector. And already we'll see people thinking, well, I was going to, try for another year, keep going with my career and start it again after Brexit, or actually, after COVID, or I won't bother, is that this is an organism of people, and those people need to have the confidence that those routes to that business model that EU touring provides will be open for them in the future. As I say, the Prime Minister has said he will sort it out, but we just need to encourage him that we're watching and expecting for him to do that and to get his ministers to do that. And I think ahead of Lord Frost appearing at the DCMS Select Committee, we do need some focus on that, because if he slips in and out of the DCMS Select Committee and there's masses of other news going on, then he'll just I've answered a few questions and I'm off. Caroline Dinage has given evidence to the DCMS Select Committee, but I know what it's like in government is if there's a lot of focus on it on a select committee, then you think, oh, well, we better do something before we go. So we've got something to say to them. We don't want to go in there and say, oh, we haven't done anything. So actually, I think ahead of that, June the 10th, I think any manager, any tour organizer, any agent, any artist who writes to their own MP or who contacts Oliver Dowden by email or Julian Knight or Lord Frost, that is a really good thing to do. And you can copy in Tom or you can copy in me so that we know what's going on. But we need they need to know action. That this matters. Yeah.
Tom, before I go to, I can see we've got some questions in the Q&A. Before I go to those questions, do you want to make any comments?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with Harriet in terms of the urgency and kind of where we are. I think what you actually saw, in January, February, yes, there was this really big pushback, and I think that is the example of like the government was on the back foot then, and they did feel under pressure, and they didn't feel that it was something they were not expecting. They then set up this kind of system, this working group system, which I said, like, we're participating, other organisations such as Musicians Union, the Incorporated Society of Musicians, all those organisations are part of that as well. But because there hasn't been another moment like that again, that's probably why they're happy with that route. And as Harriet so expertly kind of articulated, there is this key moment, I think, there is going to come where there is opportunity to make some difference and to change minds within government, or at least, as Harriet said, raise the profile. And I think she's absolutely right about there's very prominent Brexiteers. People actually were very supportive of the idea of us leaving the European Union within the Conservative Party, who are actually very supportive of this campaign. So it doesn't, whether you're in favour of leave or remain, it's actually quite a universal issue. People want people to tour and remain touring. So it need not get bogged down in those kind of difficult issues which we've had over the last few years. It's beyond that almost.
So there is a question about the fact that Priti Patel a few weeks ago made a very huge announcement about the expansion on the global talent visas, whereby if somebody had a Grammy or something like that they could come into the UK. Where does she fit into these types of negotiations and seeking support for a visa-free?
Well, I think she's quite important because she deals with the incoming. And all of these things need to be reciprocal. So if we've been generous and partnership minded, and we offer for EU musicians feasible routes to come here, it makes it much easier for that then to be reciprocated. Oh, am I on mute? Anyway,
no, you're fine.
Okay, so basically, I just writing to Priti Patel as she undertakes this review to say, this is what I think that you need to be doing in relation to the creative sector. Now, there's this argument, we've got to be very careful about human trafficking for sexual exploitation. But actually, and I've worked on human trafficking for sexual exploitation for absolutely years, and it has been rife as a problem with, massage parlors, with within the hotel industry, within all sorts of sectors. And it has not been the idea that this issue of the creative interaction and reciprocity gets caught on human trafficking is just a completely
bizarre and absurd.
Red herring. It's a red herring. So, I mean, I think picking up what you said is that about what Tom said about the politics of it is that the Prime Minister could have said, look, Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means end of free movement. Brexit means drawing up the drawbridge and, policing our borders. Sorry, but actually what you were doing was pre-Brexit and you can't do that anymore. He did not say that. He said, I know this is a problem and I'm going to sort it out. So actually, we haven't got insuperable ideological problems within the governing party. That would be very problematic. It is just a question of making it more salient so they feel compelled to do something about it. But I've seen we've got some very interesting questions.
We do. So I will do the first one. There's been mention of negotiations between the EU and the UK. Can anyone tell us what the EU offered and what the UK proposed?
The answer to that is not specifically, because although we've asked the UK government to publish what it was that the EU offered that we felt was not right, and asked them to publish what our counter proposal was, they've refused to do that. And we've said, you should publish it because we can't help you if we're kept in the dark. We might be able to help find ways around things. We might be able to help smooth things along with other European countries. But if you keep us in the dark, then it's not clear. And of course, that leaves an opportunity for the EU to say, well, we did offer something that was perfectly feasible and the UK were unreasonable. And for the UK to say, well, actually, what they offered didn't work. But because we haven't been able to see the actual specifics because they haven't published it, and it's not commercially confident, it's not about national security, it doesn't involve personal privacy, so why not publish it? Okay. It's just annoying.
So the next, sorry, Tom.
We have not been party to it or aware of it either. So we can't help. Obviously, we have lots of member organisations who have sister bodies in other member states, and it would be really helpful to deploy them and actually get them to talk to their governments, because they still want but because we're not getting that information, it is very hard to kind of really properly engage in the way that we should be.
And Tom, are they doing that? So similar organisations like yourself, are they talking to their governments and stuff?
I think as you see in certain, yes, I think you've got to look at Europe as in certain countries. There's huge appetite for British music, UK music, and obviously some less so. So there are obviously the concentrations where I think obviously in the kind of Western European countries where maybe it's high language spoken, English language spoken, there is obviously a lot of huge enthusiasm for UK music. But that's not to say that there aren't other areas in Europe too where there are areas, bands, organisations, musicians who are incredibly popular too. So yeah, there is work that's being done in that way, but we just need to arm them with the right resources and material where they can hold their own governments to account through the kind of EU mechanisms as well.
Okay, thanks. So another question is a bilateral agreement with member states even legally feasible? Given the strictures surrounding treaty law, both the TFEU and the TCA, does talking about the prospect of bilateral agreements nurture false expectations?
I'm not a lawyer, and I appreciate I'm in a room with very legally qualified people. My understanding is because the EU didn't have competency over individual member state immigration systems, it would be possible to have some kind of bilateral.
Third country nationals.
Yeah,
the control of third country nationals, I think, is down to each individual member state, which is why we have to worry about the laws of each member state that we want to go to as British citizens to work now. So yeah, it should be legally feasible. I suppose it's more of a question of political will, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm going to say yes.
There's also a question of whether we can do it with groups of countries. Can we have a sort of Baltic bubble, or can we have a sort of, Spain and Portugal? There's ways they could be moving down the road, really, if they were trying. But I think that working groups of quite low level in the hierarchy civil servants is not, that's kind of activity, but it's not progress, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's a point, sort of, Tom, that you mentioned when in a while back when you said some of the people even coming into the UK, if they're using the PPE route, then when they get to our borders here, they often come across quite challenging, or could come across challenging immigration officers. And that's not because they're trying to be difficult, but what it is they might not even understand what the person's coming in to do. And once you start talking to that person, opening a number of questions, that poor person might just even get it wrong a little bit, and then they're refused entry, and then there's a whole raft of things that they kind of come across, Yeah, I
think it's an important point as well to realise that people's careers can be ruined if they don't follow immigration rules properly, etc. They really put a bad mark against them. Obviously, an industry like music, we want to. America's is such a huge market too, and especially if you're trying to get a visa to go to America and you've got some kind of difficulty there, there's a knock-on consequence of it. And so if you are erecting barriers, you're creating problems, more bureaucracy, undoubtedly people are going to come across by that, and that can be incredibly damaging if you don't have the right system and infrastructure in place.
Yeah. So we've got another question, and this is: as a tour manager, the freedom of movement issues seem manageable, albeit far from ideal. But short term, we can get on with it and put a tour together. However, the situation is what concerns me most. As it stands, this is a complete showstopper. Do the speakers appreciate that this is an absolute priority, and what solutions are being looked at? Yeah. I think in some ways the solution right now as it stands is if somebody wants to tour, a UK national wants to tour in a European country, they have to look at the regulations and the immigration rules in that country. I think, and that's what you've all said, basically. And even from a work permit perspective, if you're applying in France, Germany or Italy, each of those countries have their own systems, which could take months for you to get permission in that one country, but by then you're supposed to be touring in another country. So when you apply in that other country, that will take some time. So, sorry, I'm answering this question for you, but what I think really the solution is that if you're successful on what you want from the government and getting reciprocal agreements, that's the solution, surely.
I think the question is also talking about the cabotage issue, the situation. So, I mean, I don't know, Tom, if you're having... I mean, it is an area of great concern as well, and that's obviously the focus of this session is more on immigration, migration, but certainly we've been in discussions with Department for Transport, Culture, Media and Sports as well about this issue. I think there have been some attempts to get a form of cultural exemption from that, but again, I think what is happening, we're kind of Brexited at a time when there was going to be some changes in the system with cabotage anyway, so it's almost like it's a double problem for us. But there is a very big risk that a huge infrastructure within the music industry, the UK music industry, may have to relocate in order to operate their businesses, because the cabotage system is what the changes are being made may be so somewhat viable. So there is work that's being done. Again, but it is one of those issues where we haven't got an agreement at the moment too.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I can see that we're sort of running out of time. So it seems as though all politicians are subject to public accountability, and music might be an industry that bridges political party divides, as it affects all of their constituents personally and emotionally. Why is there no media campaign underway to draw attention to this failure to address? Where are the bigger artists speaking out? That's the question. But in answer to that question, what I might just say briefly, and Tom and Harriet, please, feel free. I saw a lot of media coverage on it at the beginning of the year and over the last few months, and I know that there was a petition as well being signed by lots of artists. So I don't know whether this question really is about ongoing media campaigns, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I think if we had a DCMS select committee inquiry, we could have the big artists would come along and they would explain not only on their own behalf, but what they understand with the sector as a whole. And that would create a bit of a moment for them to be confronting MPs, and that would all be live and broadcast. And I think that would be very, very important. I do feel nervous each week that goes by if there's not a news story that keeps it up in the news. I think there've been some really good efforts. There've been the 300 organisations, there's been 100 musicians, there was Elton John, but as you said, it's been quite sparse. We've all understood culturally about the issue of the fishing industry for decades, since the Cod Wars. It's somehow terribly understood and very geographically defined. So there's groups of MPs for whom it's the only issue in their constituency. The thing about musicians is they're more evenly spread. Having said that, there's a lot in my constituency, but they are more evenly spread, and they're paying the price of having just got on with their creativity rather than constantly knocking on government's door. But I do think that we've got to have some media coverage for MPs to wake up to the fact that they've all got a role to play. They either can do something to help sort this out, or they can sit on their backside and then they'll be taking responsibility for actually the problem not being solved. So I think pressure on MPs is really, really important.
Perfect. Tom?
Yeah, and I think if I just add to that, I mean, there are definitely internal discussions, I think, with our member bodies about some kind of coordinated media campaign as such. I think that is definitely on our in tray. So in some way, I wouldn't want to say too much at this point, but you may want to watch this space. There might be something coming very soon on that.
Brilliant. I think that's a really very positive note to end on, to be honest. Honestly, I think this has been great. I really do. I think it's been fantastic, and I'm very grateful, as is Kingsley Napley, that Harriet, you joined us. Perfect. Tom, thank you so much. And of course, Robert, can't leave Robert out. But I think it's been fantastic. Like I said at the very beginning, we will review the recording. We will, of course, edit it, and we'll send it out to you both. And once you approve it, then we will send it to our audience. The other thing I wanted to kind of say as well is we might even do some blogging and things around before the 10th of June for the select committee. We'll do whatever we need to get some traction under this. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.